Hi, this is Craig Stocks here at Utah Desert Remote Observatories. You can find us online at utahdesertremote.com. And today we're going to be talking about this image of M81 and M82. It was captured last night with the 16-inch Dream astrograph, and it was actually captured for an hourly rental customer. We're still going to collect some more data hopefully tonight. But looking at the data, and I always review the data for rental customers before I send it to them, just to pull out any bad frames and make sure there's no problems with it. And I noticed there were some opportunities that would be worth talking about, particularly with handling the HA with Continuum subtraction, and also kind of a high dynamic range approach to the luminance data and bringing out the IFN that you get surrounding these two galaxies. So today will be focused mostly in Photoshop, but we will start out in PixInsight. Let's pick up in PixInsight. Now, I've already done some of the preliminary work. I've already run the files through WBPP to create the master files. And then I've loaded the master files, which was a red, green, and blue, plus luminosity and the hydrogen alpha. I combined the red, green, and blue monochrome files into a single RGB file. I did a dynamic crop, which I almost never do. And the only reason I did a little bit of a dynamic crop was because I wanted to use Graxpert on this data, and it gave me such a horrible edge artifact that it really messed everything up. I wish they would fix that around the edges so it didn't, that's probably the biggest problem I see with Graxpert, is that it will create edge artifacts if you don't have perfect alignment between the subs. I then ran Blur Exterminator in correct only mode, ran SPCC on the RGB file only. And the reason for running Blur Exterminator in correct only mode is the theory is that allows SPCC to identify even more stars. And then I ran Blur Exterminator again. And so we'll pick up at this point because this is where it starts to get interesting. And let's just move this out of the way. Here's our RGB data after running it through all of those processes, and it looks pretty good. The luminosity looks real interesting, and this is just with the, it's still linear with the screen stretch. But I noticed two things about this right off the bat. The core of the galaxies, especially M81 here, look like they're blown out with this amount of stretch. But there's also a fairly nice amount of IFN that's visible, even though this was just, I think in total, maybe 4 or 5 hours of data. And then lastly, the HA. Again, we've got a lot of nice HA, and a lot of the nice HA in M81, but it also has a lot of glow here in the center. So this is going to be a good candidate for continuum subtraction. So to deal with these, I want to do two things. First, I want to start with my luminosity, and I want to create a copy of this so I can create two different stretches, and then we'll blend those in Photoshop. So to do that, I'm just going to right-click and choose Duplicate. And so now we've duplicated that image, and now we're ready to do our stretches. And while I've got this image container open, I'm going to go ahead and add the clone or the copy that we just made, which is probably the one on the bottom here. And I can just double click on this, and that will add it to our image container. So now I have the luminosity, the hydrogen, the RGB, and our copy of the luminosity in my image container. And we'll use that in a little bit. So we want to go ahead and do our screen stretch, and we'll start with the luminosity clone since that's on top. And I want to do a stretch on this one so that it's darker, and I'm bringing out a lot of the detail in the core here. So to do that, I'm going to reset the screen transfer function window, and I'm just using the scroll wheel on the mouse to carefully zoom in, and you have to get the pointer between the little indicators. And then you can slide these around and fine-tune the amount of stretch. And usually I find if I darken the lights by moving it to the right, where I'm trying to bring out more detail here in the core, and I just want to get it dark enough that it's not completely white. Usually then you have to back off the blacks a little bit so that you get what results in kind of a low contrast image. And let's look in here and see, we've got good data there. So this is going to be our dark version, and so we'll do the usual PixInsight dance to apply this. And now we can switch to the next one in line. This is going to be the light luminosity. So again, let's reset this. And this time I'm focused primarily on bringing out a lot of the IFN. I'll want to darken the background a little bit, but I want to make sure that the IFN is very clearly visible, and I'm pretty much just ignoring these bright areas. And we'll apply that. And why is it not applying? Oh, just click the right square. Okay, so next there's our HA. Again, we'll reset the screen transfer, and here I'm mostly wanting to make sure we have good visibility of especially the jets around M82. It's probably going to blow out in the core a little bit, and that's okay. We'll deal with that in Photoshop. So I think I'll go with something like that. Again, I will apply that. And then lastly, the color version. And because this has already been through SPCC, we want to make sure that we keep a linked stretch. And I'm going to darken the background a little bit. And the density isn't real important on this, because what we're really after here is color information and colorful stars. So I'll go with something like that. And I usually don't remove the auto stretch until I have them all done, so that I just use that as kind of a visual reminder that I've got them in a nonlinear state. And where's our fourth one hiding? There we go. So now these are all nonlinear. They've been stretched. The last thing to run is Noise Exterminator and Star Exterminator, and save the stars, and especially we want to save the RGB stars. So I'm just going to run this image container that has all four of these images through my process container of Noise Exterminator and Star Exterminator. And I can just drag the process container triangle onto that image, or the image container onto the process container. It's running now. It's going to take it a couple minutes, so we'll pause the video and I'll pick up when it gets done. Okay, we have finished running Star Exterminator and Noise Exterminator, so now we're ready to save the files, but let's just take a quick look at them. I'm going to just close this image container. This is the luminosity stars that we darkened. This is the RGB stars, and I kind of like the way the luminosity darkened stars look in terms of just their shape and density. And of course I like the color of the RGB stars. So I'm going to save both of these. And we'll save those. Just go to Save As, and I'm going to save this on the D drive as a TIFF file. This is the stars. Save as a 16-bit. And I'm just going to quickly go through and save 16-bit versions of the rest of the files as well. luminosity stars, 16-bit TIFF. And I won't bore you with the rest of the saving. We'll pick this up when I get done. All the files are saved now as 16-bit TIFF files, so it's time to go to Photoshop. And if you've watched videos before, you know what I'm going to do. We're going to go to Scripts, Load Files into Stack, and we'll just navigate back to the D drive where I saved these. And click OK, and then OK again. And this will load all of these files so that each file becomes a layer in this one Photoshop document. And then that lets us work with how we want to combine these into the final image. Obviously we have stars and so forth. And let's just start with some housekeeping. I'm going to take the first stars image, drag it to the top, and then there's a second stars image. And if you remember, this is the monochrome, and then below it right now we have the color. I'm just going to select both of those and Control G to drop those into a group that we'll label stars. And what I want to do is put the color stars on top, and then we'll put that in color blending mode. So now what we have is the color from the RGB stars and the shapes from the monochrome stars. And you can debate whether that's better or worse, but it's a technique that's sometimes real useful. And then I will almost always add a hue saturation layer and increase the saturation a little more. And generally the red stars start to get too red, so I'll usually reduce the red saturation. And then I'll come down to the monochrome stars, and I'll add an adjustment layer right above it to darken those stars down just a little bit, and especially the whites. And that gives us what looks like nice, smooth, colorful stars. And we'll just put this whole group in screen blending mode, and then turn it off for now. We have hydrogen next, and we'll just drop that into a group, label it HA, and close it and turn it off for now. We'll come back to that later. Here is our bright luminosity, and it looks like we have a little bit of a satellite streak here. I'm guessing that's what that is. Let's see if there's anything like that in our RGB data. Here's the RGB. Go ahead and throw it in a group. You know, see, I don't see anything like that in the plain RGB, so I'm going to assume that that is an artifact that doesn't belong there. So I'm going to grab Photoshop's Remove tool, click on this layer, and just drag along that streak, and Photoshop will remove it by blending in the surrounding area. We've got some areas where there are bright stars, for instance right here, and the star removal has left a kind of a big blank spot. Let's go ahead and put this into a group. We'll label it luminosity, and I'm going to just add a blank layer right above that luminosity layer, and then I'm going to use the healing brush. A lot of people will reach for the clone stamp, and the clone stamp is almost never the answer. The healing brush is much more gentle, and what I want to do is just copy some of this texture down here, and it looks like we have the same problem here. This works like the clone stamp, only it blends rather than just flat out replacing. And there's a couple places where we have, you know, just a lack of texture from star removal, and so that's what I'm doing, is just putting some texture back in that area. We do want to be careful we don't, like I did there, I accidentally duplicated some galaxies. I guess the people who live in those galaxies might appreciate that, but I just grabbed the erase tool to erase that little piece. We'll go back to the healing brush and we'll try this again. And it looks like we have some here. Oop, duplicated another galaxy, which obviously you don't want to do. This area is a little tricky because it has, these have a lot of stuff going on. So I'm going to use a different technique here to clean up. And again, those are just areas where there were bright stars. I'm going to add another blank layer and put it in soft light blending mode. And then I'll grab my brush tool, tap D for the default colors, which is black and white. I've got 10% opacity. I can use the left bracket key to make the brush smaller. And now when I paint in this area, it will darken whatever's there. And I'm just going to darken this with a big soft brush so that it blends in with the surroundings. If you go too far, you can just tap the X key and move white to your foreground color and brighten that area back. So this is another good way to deal with those star artifacts. And since this is going to be an IFN background, we want to try to smooth out anything that looks like a star artifact so that we get a nice smooth IFN result. So just working my way around a little bit. A lot of this is going to wind up getting cropped out most likely, especially along the edges. So we'll say that's good enough for now. So this is our IFN data. And in fact, let's change this to IFN. And now we can turn this layer off. This is our dark RGB. And again, we'll darken the background. And we're trying to bring some contrast into these, the core of these galaxies. Something like that. We may want to darken this even a little bit more. This time I'm going to use another adjustment layer, levels adjustment layer. Darken, bring in a little bit more detail in the core, but I only want to apply it into the core. So I'm going to invert the mask so that it becomes black. Now we've just hidden all of that adjustment. Now I can switch to a white brush and usually a fairly aggressive, like a 50% opacity. And if I paint with white, that paints that darkening adjustment layer back in. And we may even want a little bit in the core here. So let's say that's our luminosity for the two galaxies. And this will be luminosity. Lastly, we have our color layer. Other than changing color balance and saturation, changes in luminosity won't affect this because this is really just for color information. So I'm just tinkering with the color balance a little bit before I start to combine things. I think that'll be good. So let's label this RGB. Now we're ready to really get to work. So our luminance layer will turn on. And this is, again, the luminosity for just the galaxies. And we're going to put this in luminosity blending mode. So now we have the luminosity from the L layer and the color coming through from the RGB. And I'm seeing an awful lot of yellow and green here in the highlights, so I think I'll come back to our color balance and put some magenta in there and maybe a little bit of blue to knock out that green. That looks, visually that looks better. Now we've got our IFN, and you'll notice when we turn on the IFN layer, it just blows out the galaxies. And overall, it's probably too bright. So we'll start by putting in a levels adjustment layer, darken the background a little bit. And then we really need to darken it or not include it at all where the galaxies are. And that's where we're going to use another layer mask. So we'll click on the front loading washer looking icon down here, and this will add a layer mask, and we're adding it to the group layer. And again, we'll paint with a black brush because we want to hide this. And I'll go to 50% opacity, which I got by just tapping the 5 key while the brush tool was active. And we'll darken or remove this layer. Maybe something like that. It becomes a bit of a challenge because you can only show dark against light or light against dark, and you need some combination of light and dark. So, maybe some locally removing this, which is going to cause the IFN to fade out a little bit around the galaxies so that the galaxies then can appear bright against a dark background. They don't really stand out if you just have a light galaxy against a light background. And if we turn the stars on just for a quick preview, that's kind of where we're at now. Galaxies are probably still a little bit bright, which we could address by coming back to our luminosity layer and darkening those down a little bit more. Now we want to add the HA. And if we just turn it on, if you recall, of course, this is a monochrome file, but we have a lot of detail in the jets coming out of M82 and a lot of nebula detail around M81. And if I just turn this on and add the hydrogen, which I would do by first putting this layer in screen blending mode, and then double-clicking again on the layer group, turn off green and blue so that we're just adding red. And what happens is we add too much red. There's red kind of being added everywhere. We can tone it down a little bit, and we can use some masking, but it's hard to separate it. And the problem is we've picked up a lot of that continuum red from our RGB data. So we want to use continuum subtraction to control where the HA comes through. And we're going to use the red data for that. And what we want to do is come back to our red image. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. An easy way to do it is to go to the channels layer, which you very rarely would see me do, and look at just the red layer. And in fact, we can copy that with Control A to select all, and then Control C to copy. We have to go back to RGB, go back to our layers palette. Let's turn everything back on. And if we come up to the HA layer and add a blank layer and then Control V, what we've done now is add, this is the red from our RGB, and it looks red because I have only red turned on here. You can see this is in fact a monochrome image. And let's just leave it in monochrome for the time being. That's our HA. This is our red continuum. And we want to subtract the continuous red from the HA, and that'll leave us with a more distinct HA. To do that, we're going to put this layer in subtract blending mode. And you can see just immediately the jets now stand out. The nebulae in M81 stand out, and pretty much all the rest of that red has just disappeared. If we now put our HA into just red and we're again in screen blending mode. We need to brighten it up a little bit, so now we can just use this overall curves layer, brighten that up, turn everything else back on, and now we have the HA being added with continuum subtraction to clean up the red that has bled into the HA because it was so bright. And that gives us a much cleaner, we turn it on and off, much cleaner view of just the HA. Turn our stars back on. We need to turn on our IFN details. And there it is with IFN. So we're starting to approach a finished image here. Let's turn our stars on. Starting to approach a finished image. One of the challenges is the IFN, and you kind of have to decide what you want to be the subject. Do you want it to be the IFN, or do you want it to be the galaxies? And you can see if we turn the IFN off, the galaxies really pop and really stand out nicely. We're getting a little bit of red from the HA, so let's clean that up just a little bit. I just went back to the levels adjustment layer on the HA after the continuum subtraction. So we've got real nice galaxies here, and against a very dark black background. And I'll usually clean up the background by adding a solid color layer between the stars and everything else. So just below the stars, what I want to do is add a solid color layer, and we will use hex 131313, which is RGB 191919, and we'll put that in lighten blending mode. And what that does is just lifts up the background so that nothing is completely black. The darkest pixels in here are going to be 191919. And just fine tune a little bit on the color balance. So now let's decide what we want to do with the IFN. I'll turn the IFN layer back on, and to me that looks too strong. It washes out the galaxies. So there's a couple ways we could deal with this. We could use the mask and mask it out even more, or we can darken it a little bit more, or even some combination of that. Probably we want to keep it fairly bright around the edges, and let's use the mask a little bit more to darken the IFN right around the galaxies so that they have an opportunity to stand out and not get washed out by the IFN. So maybe something like that. You can shift click on a mask to turn it on and off. And that's what the IFN mask is accomplishing for us. And we may want to boost the HA a little bit. I'll just brighten that up a little. And you may want to do some global adjustments, again, above the top layer and below that solid fill. I would typically add a levels adjustment, a color balance, and a hue saturation. And these are going to be my global adjustments to fine-tune the image overall. And then, of course, eventually I will do my final fine-tuning in Lightroom. So that's probably a pretty decent result at this point. You could come back and fine-tune and play with this for a long time. Maybe a little bit of IFN there. I would probably rotate this 90 degrees, but I'll just leave it as it is here. And this is probably a good place to stop. So I hope you found this useful. If you have any questions, be sure to drop them in the comments below, and I'll try to address them. And just kind of a quick reminder, This is an LRGB plus HA image. We duplicated the luminosity so that we have a bright version for the IFN and a dark version to bring out the detail in the galaxies. And then we used Continuum subtraction to clean up the HA signal so that it really focused on just the jets coming out of the M82 galaxy and the nebulae in M81. So with that, I hope you have a great day today and an even better night tonight under a clear, dark sky. Thanks.